Thomas Harper never thought much of the boundaries until the morning he noticed the unfamiliar sound of grinding metal beyond the trees behind his home. It was early spring in Vermont, and the thaw had only just begun to loosen the earth. His property, a narrow but elongated plot bordered at its rear by a shallow meandering creek, had long been a quiet refuge, an unspoken edge where the world seemed to pause. The creek wasn't majestic, but it had character, a twisting line of cold water edged with mossy stones and shaded by stubborn alder trees. For Thomas, who had spent the better part of the last decade restoring his modest two-story house and its surroundings, the creek symbolized the final, quiet line between his world and everything else. It wasn't on the official records as a dividing line, it was too old and too minor for that, but it had always been treated as one by the people who lived nearby. His neighbor, Karen Westmore, had moved in just 2 years prior. Her property ran parallel to his on the opposite bank. She arrived with large patio furniture, rolled turf, contractors, and the kind of meticulous landscaping plans that made it clear she wasn't here just to live. She was here to transform. They'd exchanged pleasantries once or twice, nothing remarkable. She was in her mid-50s, energetic in that slightly overbearing way, with a voice that could carry across a field and a habit of waving at people while giving them instructions. Thomas had made a habit of nodding politely and retreating to his tool shed. There had never been animosity between them. Not until now. That morning, the noise had drawn him to the back fence where the trees thinned out and gave way to the muddy bank. Beyond the creek, barely 10 feet from his property, stood 2 men in construction jackets unloading slabs of concrete pavers. One of them held a clipboard. The other had a tamper. Behind them, Karen stood, gesturing confidently to where the creek curved gently around a cluster of stones. At her feet lay bundles of rebar and a half-open container of concrete mix. It took Thomas a moment to process what he was seeing, and another full minute to accept the fact that Karen was building something that crossed directly over the creek, something permanent. He stepped around his fence, careful not to slip in the thawed mud, and called across the water, "Morning." "What's all this?" Karen turned, smiled like she'd been expecting him, and called back in a tone as sweet as oversteeped tea. "Good morning, Thomas. Just a little access path. It's going to make it easier to get to the back meadow, for the community events I've been organizing." Thomas blinked. "What kind of path?" "A stone walkway. Stable, safe, beautiful. And inclusive," she added as though reading from a brochure. "We're going to install a few benches and maybe a little solar lighting, just enough to make it pleasant in the evenings." He glanced down at the water, then at the materials they were offloading. "You're putting that across the creek?" "Yes, right across. Don't worry, it's not going to disturb anything. The contractor said it'll be environmentally low impact. Besides, the creek isn't really anyone's, is it?" That sentence stuck. The creek isn't really anyone's. It echoed in his head as he stood silently, taking in the assumption that had allowed her to skip the step where one might knock on a neighbor's door and say, "Hey, I have an idea. Can we talk about it?" Thomas didn't respond. He just nodded once and stepped back from the bank. He didn't yell, didn't argue. He wasn't the type. But that evening, he dug through the old drawer where he kept the original property documents from when he bought the house. It was a mismatched stack of surveys, receipts, letters from the previous owner, and a few official-looking maps with faded stamps and barely legible markings. He scanned every page, looking for anything that might clarify the exact location of his rear boundary. It wasn't easy. Nothing about this land was clean-cut. But one thing was consistent. The creek had always marked a natural end to every drawing. Not a dotted line, not a property division officially, but a limit. One that had been respected, until now. By the end of the week, Karen's crew had already laid the footings. Steel mesh rose from the ground like a skeleton, bending slightly under the weight of the wet cement being poured into wooden frames. The walkway curved gently over the creek, anchored on both sides in a manner that looked rushed and temporary, like someone hoping to finish quickly before questions were asked. Thomas didn't interfere. He watched from his kitchen window, silently drinking coffee, letting every pore of concrete settle into his memory. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't about property lines or even the aesthetics. What unsettled Thomas most was the presumption that someone could stand beside something that had existed for decades, functioning perfectly well as a natural boundary, and decide that it was now inconvenient, that it could be absorbed, paved over, improved. He tried to talk to her once more. "Karen," he said, walking up to her one afternoon as she adjusted a decorative metal lantern by the edge of the construction. She looked up, almost startled, but smiled. "Thomas, I'm so glad you came by. You'll see, once it's done, the whole area will feel more connected. We'll be able to host things, maybe some weekend yoga, or—" "It's not your land," he interrupted, calmly but firmly. "The creek's not part of your parcel." Her smile didn't drop, but it tightened. "It's not part of yours either. It runs between us." She shrugged. "Which makes it common, right? Shared space?" "That's not how it works," he said, and there was something harder in his voice now, something edged. "Well," she said, stepping back and brushing her hands together, "if you want to contest it, I suppose you're free to go through the appropriate channels. But I really hope you won't. This is meant to be good for the neighborhood. It's just a path, Thomas. Let's not make it a battle." But Thomas wasn't interested in battles. What he wanted, what he expected, was something far simpler: respect. And as he walked back to his side of the creek, past the low hum of cement mixers and the idle laughter of the contractors, he knew that if respect wasn't offered freely, then the line would have to be redrawn. Not with confrontation, but with consequence. So he waited, and he planned. Because while the creek might not have been listed on any deed, and while the concrete might now rest heavy across its bed, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Water always remembers the shape of what once was. It moves, it erodes, it pushes back, and eventually it takes back what it's owed. And Thomas, in his quiet, steady way, intended to help it do just that. The rain began 3 days after Karen's construction team finished laying the final slab. It wasn't the kind of gentle spring drizzle that soaked into the ground and disappeared overnight. It was a sharp, insistent downpour, driven sideways by wind and filling the air with a constant hiss that drowned out thought. Thomas stood on his back porch, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, and watched the creek swell and darken. The water, usually clear and slow, had taken on the color of churned earth and began licking at the bottom of the newly installed walkway. The stones Karen had used weren't elevated high enough, and as the current picked up, Thomas noticed it forming small whirlpools at the upstream edge of the bridge. Sediment gathered around the base, and thin sheets of debris swirled beneath the arches like warning flags in a storm. He didn't move to intervene. He didn't call Karen or shout across the water. He simply watched, brow furrowed, as the natural course of the creek struggled to reconcile with the artificial obstruction now pressing against it. The rain persisted through the night. When Thomas woke the next morning and stepped out again, the bank on his side had begun to recede. A small patch of soil, once firm, had collapsed into the creek, dragged away by a steady undercurrent now redirected by the walkway's flawed geometry. There was standing water at the edge of his shed. A section of his fence leaned slightly forward, its posts no longer anchored in solid ground. Thomas didn't panic. He opened the shed, pulled out a long-handled probe, and began checking the soil composition near the bank. It wasn't scientific, but he could feel the looseness, the sponginess. The ground that had once cradled the creek had become unstable. It was not just erosion. It was interference. Man-made shaping of nature gone wrong. Later that day, he sent a message to the local Water and Soil District office. Nothing aggressive, a general inquiry about unauthorized waterway alterations and any available guidance. He received an automated reply thanking him for his concern and promising a response within 10 to 15 business days. Not ideal, but he had expected as much. Bureaucracy, in its own way, flowed like water too, slow, winding, and rarely direct. That evening, Karen held what she called a soft launch gathering for the new walkway. Strings of battery-powered lights were hung from poles, paper lanterns floated in puddles near her garden path, and the air was filled with the sound of wine glasses clinking and casual laughter. Thomas stayed inside, watching from his window as her guests, neighbors he barely knew, walked confidently across the stones that now cut directly through the natural flow between their homes. A folding table had been set up right at the far end of the walkway, laden with cheese trays and finger foods. Someone gave a toast. Thomas couldn't hear the words over the glass, but he saw Karen raise a flute of champagne and smile with theatrical satisfaction, the kind that had less to do with joy and more to do with claiming something. The next morning, Thomas woke to find the bank had deteriorated further. A crescent of earth had vanished from beneath the dogwood tree, leaving exposed roots dangling above the water. His compost bin had shifted, tilting sideways, and a trail of mulch had washed into the creek. That was the moment he decided to move beyond observation. He documented everything: photos of the bank's decay, timestamps from weather reports, soil displacement. He didn't go online to rant or rally support. Instead, he called a local environmental engineering consultant. Not a large firm, but an independent guy who had been recommended by someone at the feed store, someone who had dealt with septic runoff issues upstream. The man's name was Travis, and when he showed up 2 days later with his mud-crusted boots and quiet demeanor, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. They spent nearly an hour walking the property, measuring flow direction, water velocity, soil retention. Travis said little at first, which Thomas appreciated. He wasn't there for small talk. After examining the bridge structure from both sides and taking notes on a small, water-stained pad, Travis finally spoke. "This wasn't designed to accommodate runoff," he said. "She's created a backflow pocket. During a serious rain, the creek's forced to slow down right at the bridge, which makes it spill out both sides instead of moving through." Thomas nodded. "Can you put that in writing?" Travis shrugged. "Sure. I mean, it's not a formal hydrology report, but I can document what I saw and what it's doing. Want it to file a complaint?" "I just want the record to exist," Thomas said. Travis returned a few days later with a typed, signed report. It was calm, factual, and unequivocal. The construction had redirected the flow. It had already caused minor erosion and, if unaddressed, would likely worsen. Thomas sent the report to the Soil and Water Office along with his original inquiry, now marked Follow-up with Expert Observation. He didn't expect immediate action, but it was no longer just his word against a well-lit stone path and a glass of celebratory wine. Still, Karen showed no signs of acknowledging the impact. In fact, she had expanded her setup. A new bench had appeared at the midpoint of the walkway, bolted directly into the stone. A small wrought iron arch had been installed at the entrance, complete with hanging ferns and an engraved plaque that read, "Unity Crossing." The symbolism wasn't lost on Thomas. When he passed Karen near the mailbox that Friday, she greeted him with a tone that bordered on performative cheer. "Thomas, isn't the new walkway just lovely? I've had so many compliments. You really should come over for the next event. We're thinking a small acoustic music evening next weekend. Very tasteful." He didn't respond right away, just looked at her with a level gaze. "You've redirected a waterway. It's causing structural damage to my land." She blinked. "Oh, come on. It's barely a trickle. Don't be dramatic." "It's not dramatic," he said. "It's physical displacement. Erosion. I have a report from an engineer, if you're interested." Her smile faded slightly. "Well, I suppose you're free to pursue it however you like. I just hope we can remain good neighbors." Thomas didn't smile. That would require mutual respect. She didn't answer. The silence hung between them, charged, and then she turned and walked briskly back up her driveway. That weekend he noticed a group of younger guests at Karen's property. They were placing tiki torches along the edge of the creek, perhaps as part of some decorative setup. One of them walked close to the eroding bank and nearly slipped in the mud. No one was hurt, but Thomas saw what would happen next, not in theory, but in real terms. Water kept moving, people didn't, and when the imbalance reached a certain point, nature didn't hesitate. So he began preparing, not for retaliation, but for mitigation. He wasn't going to sabotage the structure or dig at night like some unhinged recluse. He was going to study the weak point, understand where Karen had failed to account for the environment, and let gravity and flow do what they had always done when people ignored them. Not out of malice, but because nature doesn't argue, and he would be ready when it did what it always does. The next heavy rain didn't wait for the reports to reach a desk, nor did it care about decorative plaques or community goodwill. It came in the middle of the night, unexpected and sharp, not as long as the previous storm, but heavier, pounding the ground with such force that Thomas woke to the sound of it hammering his roof like fists of water. He rose instinctively, pulled on his boots, and stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand. The creek roared louder than it ever had before, the sound unmistakable. Not rushing, not babbling. Roaring. He moved toward the rear of the property, boots sinking into the already saturated grass, and as the flashlight beam cut across the darkened yard, it caught the unmistakable shape of something collapsed. A section of the right bank, the side closest to the newly installed walkway, had given way entirely. The water had undercut the base of the stone slab and pulled it downward, creating a visible sag in the path. One of the decorative benches now sat lopsided, half of its legs submerged and twisted toward the current. The wrought iron arch Karen had installed still stood upright, but it leaned unnaturally toward the void like a figure preparing to fall. A thin stream of debris, sticks, mulch, and bits of paper flowed underneath the walkway, which now directed the water not through but around and against Thomas's side of the creek with even greater intensity. He stood there for nearly half an hour, flashlight trained on the damage, rain soaking through the shoulders of his coat. He said nothing. He did nothing. Not yet. But he began to count the consequences one by one, with cold, quiet precision. The following morning, he documented the aftermath. The photos now showed visible damage, not theoretical, not predicted, but present. The bench, the shift in the walkway, the erosion beneath his fence line, the muddy breach where his compost barrel had once been. He compiled everything into a folder. This time, he didn't wait on bureaucracies. He went directly to the County Code Enforcement Office with the engineering report, before and after photos, and written notes. He spoke calmly, provided dates, offered no dramatic claims, and simply asked that the matter be reviewed by an on-site inspector. He expected delays. Instead, he got quiet urgency. Within 72 hours, a representative from the county arrived with a surveyor and a field tablet. Thomas didn't hover. He answered their questions, showed them the locations, then stepped aside and let them do their work. The field rep, a middle-aged man named Dale, moved deliberately and said little, but Thomas saw his expression shift when they reached the far end of the walkway. Dale crouched, examined the exposed understructure, and muttered something to his assistant, who took a measurement and scribbled in a notebook. Later, Dale turned to Thomas and said, "We're going to flag this for review. I can't make a determination on my own, but it looks like it was constructed without any formal oversight. If that's the case, and it's affecting adjacent properties, there could be consequences. Do you have any documentation of when this was installed?" "I don't. I was never consulted." Dale nodded. "Then we'll be following up with your neighbor. I'd appreciate it if you didn't make direct contact while we're handling this. Things like this, They go sideways fast when neighbors get personal. Thomas understood. He had no interest in going personal. He was well past that. By the end of the week, county tags appeared at either end of Karen's walkway, small laminated signs warning of an ongoing investigation into unauthorized land development. Karen's reaction was swift and public. She stood at the edge of her property the next morning, phone in hand, pacing in a carefully staged line of indignation. She wasn't yelling, but her voice was loud enough to carry across the creek, sharp and clipped, as she spoke into the phone about overreach, male neighbors with grudges, and witch hunts. Thomas didn't acknowledge her. He was in his shed, cleaning tools, the door half open, letting the sound of her frustration drift in like an annoying insect too slow to swat. But things changed after the tags went up. That was the first time Thomas noticed people he didn't recognize entering Karen's yard. Not neighbors, not friends, but men in button-down shirts and clipboards, some with orange vests, others in plain clothes. There were quiet conversations near the back patio, glances toward the walkway, and quick exits through the side gate. It didn't take a genius to guess what was happening. Karen had overstepped something, and now she was being pulled into a process she couldn't control with charm or wine glasses. Still, she didn't stop. Within a week, Thomas saw a crew of landscapers arrive, different from the ones who had laid the walkway. These ones were quieter, more efficient, not laying stone but planting dense, fast-growing shrubs along the property edge. At first it seemed like harmless re-landscaping, but it became clear that the shrubs were being placed with precision, right up to the disputed bank, partially obscuring the view of the collapsed section of the path. Camouflage. Not a solution, a cover-up. He kept documenting. Not just the bank, but the placement of each plant, the shifts in water levels, the slow reformation of the channel as it tried to find a new way around the obstruction. Nature didn't wait for county decisions. It moved constantly, reshaping the world whether humans liked it or not. And Karen's efforts to conceal the damage only made things worse. By compressing the visual space, she forced the water to divert even more violently toward Thomas's side, where the now softened ground began to buckle in strange, uneven waves. That was when Thomas acted. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but tactically. He placed small drainage rods at intervals along the worst-affected parts of his bank. He didn't remove soil or interfere with the walkway. He simply helped the water move where it wanted to move. Aided gravity, not redirected it. The result was subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but the impact grew quickly. Within days, the water flowed more aggressively under the path's weak point. The sagging section shifted again, barely an inch but enough to create an audible creak when stepped on, and Karen, in a moment of either defiance or delusion, still used the walkway, now with practiced steps between the visibly sinking slabs. One afternoon, as he worked near the shed, Thomas heard voices. Not from Karen's yard, but from the edge of the creek. A group of teenage kids, possibly friends of her niece or one of her neighbors, had wandered down and were playing near the water. One of them stepped onto the walkway and immediately slipped, nearly falling sideways into the fast-moving current. Thomas moved quickly, no hesitation, and helped pull the boy back onto his feet. The kid was startled but unharmed. Karen wasn't home. That night he wrote a short note and left it in her mailbox. It read, simply, "Someone could get hurt. You need to block access immediately." The note received no response, but 2 days later Karen installed a temporary plastic fence at one end of the walkway. Not a barricade, not a closure, just enough to claim plausible concern. Enough to say she had addressed it. But Thomas wasn't playing the game of optics. He was watching the weather forecast. And the next rain, when it came, would be enough. He knew it now. The structure wouldn't hold, and when it failed, it wouldn't need his hand. Only patience, because all he had done was make space for water to move the way it always had, before someone tried to pave over its truth. The next rain didn't arrive with the same drama as the last. It came as a steady, soaking curtain that lingered through the night and into the gray morning. Not violent, but unrelenting, as though the sky had decided to loosen itself slowly and thoroughly. By the time Thomas stepped out onto his back porch at dawn, the grass was already soft beneath his boots, and the air carried the faint sourness of saturated mulch. He didn't need to check the bank to know what had happened overnight. He could hear it in the sound of the creek. The familiar babble was gone, replaced by a deeper, more aggressive current that pulsed steadily like breath drawn through clenched teeth. He approached the edge carefully, scanning the distance between his fence line and the walkway. It had finally happened. Not the collapse, not yet, but something close enough. The sagging slab had dropped further, and the middle section of the walkway now bowed unmistakably toward the creek bed, like the spine of a book broken down the center. A segment of railing on Karen's side had snapped clean off and lay at a crooked angle, one end submerged, the other resting awkwardly atop a half-buried bench that had tilted into the softening mud. Thomas didn't smile. He didn't feel vindicated. He simply took it all in with the same quiet clarity that had carried him through the last few weeks. The materials had failed exactly as expected, not because of sabotage or malice, but because they had been asked to defy gravity, time, and water without any of the support they required. Later that morning, an unfamiliar vehicle pulled into Karen's driveway. It wasn't a contractor's truck or a landscaping crew van. It was a black SUV with municipal plates and no markings, the kind of car used by low-profile city personnel sent to quietly assess situations without drawing attention. Two people got out, a woman in a beige raincoat with a folder tucked under her arm, and a man in a dark sweater who carried a surveyor's pole. Thomas didn't try to approach them, but he noticed that both stood at the end of the walkway for some time, pointing toward the bowed section, then across the creek toward his bank. They took photos. They made notes. And at one point, the woman removed a small red flag from her folder and stabbed it into the ground near the base of the archway, right where the first section of Karen's concrete had cracked weeks earlier. It was a quiet, bureaucratic act, but it held weight. Karen came out eventually, wearing a long coat and rubber clogs, her expression tight with barely veiled irritation. Thomas watched her posture, straight-backed, arms folded, eyes constantly shifting between the officials and the damaged path. There was no warm greeting, no wine-glass smile. She gestured quickly, pointed, shook her head a few times. The woman in the raincoat said something, holding up a hand with slow, deliberate motion, and Karen stopped talking. The interaction lasted less than 15 minutes. Then the officials left as calmly as they had arrived, and Karen stood alone by the walkway, staring at the sagging stones as though they'd betrayed her. That evening, Thomas received an email from the county, a formal notification. The construction on the creek was under review for violation of environmental stability codes and would remain flagged until further notice. No action was required from him, but he was advised to secure his side of the creek bank with temporary barriers and report any further erosion. It wasn't a judgment, but it was an acknowledgement. A bureaucratic finger gently pointing in his direction and saying, "We see it." Despite the damage, Karen didn't close the path. She didn't rope it off, didn't install signage. She simply stopped using it, and for a while that was enough. The plastic fence she had put up weeks earlier remained half-collapsed at one end, sagging like a shrug. Guests stopped visiting. The music from her garden ceased, and the ferns under the archway began to brown and curl unnoticed. But the story didn't fade. 3 days later, Thomas received a visit, not from an inspector or an attorney, but from a neighbor 2 houses down, a man named Elliot who had kept mostly to himself since moving in the year before. He was middle-aged, wore thick glasses, and held himself with the quiet posture of someone who avoided conflict by default. They spoke at the fence line, and Thomas offered him coffee, but he declined. Instead, Elliot asked if Thomas had a moment to talk about the Walkway situation. His voice was careful, measured. Apparently, Karen had approached him and several other neighbors with a petition, one aimed at gathering support to claim the walkway as a shared community amenity. She had framed it as a unifying project, a minor misstep with unfair consequences, and claimed she was being targeted for trying to make the neighborhood more beautiful. She was persuasive. She had photos, handouts, even a map with boundaries blurred slightly to suggest ambiguity. Elliot hadn't signed, but others had, and he thought Thomas should know. Thomas thanked him without expressing surprise. Karen's response was expected. When cornered, she widened the frame, tried to make the issue about community and shared responsibility, to shift the narrative from recklessness to martyrdom. But the truth remained simple and stubborn. Water flowed where it wanted, and land held only as long as it had structure beneath it. Still, he understood that perception mattered. If enough people believed that Karen was being wronged, the pressure might shift. And so, he made a choice, not to speak out or accuse, but to clarify. He printed copies of the engineering report, photos from the early stages of erosion, and a one-page summary of events with no adjectives, no loaded terms, just dates and descriptions. Then, quietly, he mailed them, not to every neighbor, but to the handful of people who had signed Karen's petition. Anonymous envelopes. No letters, no arguments, just facts. He never heard a word about it. But 2 days later, Elliot passed him on the sidewalk and gave a small, knowing nod. That night, Thomas returned to the creek bank. The air was still damp and the smell of wet stone lingered. He crouched near the exposed roots of the dogwood tree and placed a new marker. Nothing more than a thin wooden stake driven into the soft earth with quiet force. A visual reminder. A line, not of ownership or defiance. Just of where things had once stood before someone decided they no longer mattered. And as he rose, the rain began again, light at first, then heavier. He stood in it for a while, listening to the water reclaim its path, because the midpoint was never in the papers. It was here, where the land decided to speak louder than anyone else. By the second week of May, the creek had taken on a mind of its own. The rain had stopped for a few days, but the ground hadn't dried, and the water level hovered high and steady, refusing to recede as it usually did. Thomas noticed that the current had grown more forceful in one direction, carving deeper into the already compromised slope on his side of the bank. The damage wasn't just erosion anymore, it was structural degradation. The outermost posts of his backyard fence had shifted by several degrees, and a small retaining wall he'd built 5 years ago had begun to bow. He didn't wait for another inspection or another series of forms to be processed. He filed a direct notice of hazard with the county's Risk Assessment Division. Not a complaint, a warning, and he copied it to every department listed under environmental regulation. 3 days later, a response came. Not from an official, but from a letter delivered by hand. It was written on fine bond paper, clipped with the name of a local legal firm. The letter was from Karen's attorney. It stated, in precise, sanitized legalese, that Thomas was now being accused of contributing to environmental destabilization through his actions along the creek bank. It claimed that his installation of drainage rods constituted unlicensed modification of shared terrain, and that his photographic documentation of Karen's walkway, particularly if shared with others, could be interpreted as an attempt to defame or harass a private citizen. Thomas read the letter twice, then placed it in a folder alongside the engineering reports and photographic records. He didn't respond directly. Instead, he reached out to the environmental consultant again, Travis, and asked him to return, this time to walk the full length of the bank and file a second affidavit. This one focused not on the existence of the walkway, but on the secondary. Effects of water displacement since the original installation. Travis arrived that weekend, his demeanor even more serious than before. He didn't speak until he'd completed the walk, taken new photos, and measured the change in slope from Thomas's shed to the bank. When he did speak, his words were simple and firm. "It's worse than last time. She's diverted the flow just enough to destroy the foundation on this side. If this keeps up, that section of your yard will slip." Thomas nodded. "Will you write that down?" "I'll do better than that. I'll stamp it, notarize it, and email it directly to the Risk Division." The next week was quiet. The creek remained high, but the skies held. Thomas focused on reinforcing his side of the yard with temporary supports, long steel stakes driven at angles and connected by weather-treated cables. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't permanent, but it was enough to hold the soil until something gave on the other side. And something would. Not just because the structure was failing, but because pressure always found a way. Karen didn't speak to him directly during that time, but she made herself visible. She walked the perimeter of her yard daily, usually with a clipboard or a phone, pausing often near the collapsed section of the walkway. Once, Thomas saw her speaking with two men in suits, one of whom gestured animatedly toward the creek while the other nodded with mechanical calm. Another time, she stood at the archway, arms crossed, watching Thomas as he tightened one of the cables along his slope. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between accusation and contempt, but she said nothing. It didn't matter. Her silence was louder than her words. Then came the truck. It was a flatbed, arriving late in the evening with no warning. Two men in reflective vests unloaded a set of orange barriers, modular plastic blocks that could be filled with water or sand, and began lining them along the outer edge of Karen's property, right where the creek bent around the walkway. Thomas stood in his yard, watching. The installation was quick, precise, and entirely unpermitted. The next morning, Karen affixed laminated signs to the barriers. "Caution. Stabilization zone. Do not enter." It was a clear message. She had decided to create the illusion of sanctioned repair, hoping perhaps that it would override any questions about legality. But Thomas didn't challenge it. He waited. 2 days later, heavy rains returned. Not a storm, but enough to raise the creek again, and this time the combination of the new barriers and the already narrowed passage created a funnel effect, forcing water into a single, high-pressure stream that surged directly beneath the weakest point of the walkway. The center sagged further, and this time, one of the support beams cracked audibly. Not a collapse, not yet, but an unmistakable structural failure. Thomas heard the sound from his porch. It was like a tree limb splitting under the weight of snow, deep, slow, and full of inevitability. The county inspector returned the following Monday, unannounced. Dale, the same man from before, walked the bank with a younger assistant and carried a heavier case this time. He said little, but the way he lingered at the broken section spoke volumes. Karen was home, but she didn't come out. Thomas watched from his window as the assistant took detailed photographs and measured the tilt of the sagging slab. Before they left, Dale planted 3 more red flags in the ground, this time not just on Karen's side, but on Thomas's too. Markers that meant the land had now crossed a line from unstable to dangerous. Thomas filed the new inspection summary in his growing file. It was no longer just about property. It was about safety. And as the weeks passed, the neighborhood began to shift. People who once nodded politely from driveways now lingered longer, their eyes drawn toward the creek whenever they passed. The walkway, once framed with flowers and benches, now stood half-sunken, cordoned off by sagging caution tape and surrounded by barriers no one believed were legal. Even those who had once admired Karen's initiative grew silent, and then came the letter from the county. An official notice mailed to both Thomas and Karen, announcing a mandatory hearing regarding the structure, its environmental impact, and the required steps for remediation. It was scheduled for 2 weeks later at the municipal center. Attendance was required. Penalties for non-compliance were listed in careful legal phrasing. Karen responded as expected. She doubled down. She had new signs made. Protect our pathway. Community rights matter. She posted flyers on bulletin boards and handed them to neighbors in plastic sleeves. She started a petition again, but this time with less success. Thomas didn't respond publicly. He simply prepared. He organized his records, reviewed the consultant's reports, and printed a single-page summary of every key date. No dramatics, no accusations, just facts. On the day of the hearing, he arrived early. The room was small, just a few chairs, a table for the board, and a space for each party to present. Karen arrived late, dressed formally, flanked by her attorney and holding a thick binder. But when the hearing began, her confidence began to wane. The county representatives presented the inspection reports, the erosion data, and the environmental impact assessments. Then they asked her for her original construction permits. She didn't have them. She deflected, claimed misunderstanding, talked about intent. But the room was indifferent to intent. When Thomas was asked to speak, he did so quietly and clearly. He explained what had changed, what had been displaced, what had been lost. He didn't accuse Karen. He didn't question her character. He simply described the consequences of her actions. The board listened. They asked questions, and then they thanked him. By the end of the session, a decision was made. The walkway would be officially condemned. Karen was ordered to have it dismantled within 30 days. A failure to comply would result in fines and, if necessary, forced removal at her expense. The barriers she had installed were to be taken down immediately. Karen didn't speak to him as she left, but Thomas didn't watch her go. He stood outside the center, breathing the cold air deeply, letting the tension seep from his shoulders. Not in triumph, not in relief, just in quiet, grounded awareness that some boundaries are worth defending, not with noise, but with endurance. And now, finally, the structure was no longer just sinking. It was coming down. The demolition wasn't instant. It came slowly, begrudgingly, like a concession made under pressure rather than one freely chosen. Karen waited until the last possible day of her 30-day compliance window to act, and when she did, she didn't hire the same crew that had built the walkway. She brought in a new set of laborers, cheaper, younger, less precise. They arrived with no identifying logos on their trucks and no formal safety barriers. The men worked quickly and without finesse, breaking the walkway into chunks of debris with jackhammers and crowbars, tossing the shattered slabs into the back of a trailer as though they were nothing more than scrap. The archway collapsed in one piece, twisted and left half buried near the bank like a relic of some failed monument. The benches were hauled away without care, their legs bent, their paint chipped by impact. There was no ceremony, no goodbye, only noise and dust, and the sudden presence of what had always been there underneath, mud, water, and the carved shape of the land as it had existed before concrete tried to overwrite it. Thomas watched from his kitchen window as the last piece of stone was dragged off. He didn't feel satisfaction, not the kind that surges or bursts. It was quieter than that. He felt the calm stillness of something restored, not in full, but enough to breathe again. The creek ran freely once more, the water gliding beneath the now empty space where Karen's structure had stood, and even though the scars remained on both banks, they no longer deepened. But the real ending didn't come with the removal of the walkway. It came the day after, a sudden shift, not in the land, but in the reaction to it. Karen had not taken the ruling with dignity. She had complied legally, yes, but she had not accepted the outcome emotionally. The very next day, she filed a formal complaint against Thomas with the Community Zoning Board, accusing him of orchestrated harassment, unauthorized drainage manipulation, and deliberate undermining of ground stability. Her claim suggested that his earlier reinforcement of his creek bank with support cables and rods had redirected water intentionally to compromise her structure. It was an absurd accusation, one with no supporting evidence, but the mere existence of the claim meant Thomas was once again drawn into a process he had hoped was finished. He received a summons for a review hearing, this time not about Karen's violation, but about his alleged contribution to the problem. The irony wasn't lost on him. After weeks of being flooded, dragged through soil assessments, and forced to watch his property buckle under water pressure created by someone else's vanity project, he now had to defend himself for trying to hold his own ground. He returned to his documents, pulled the sequence of photos, time-stamped reports, correspondence with Travis, and inspection records. He cataloged everything with calm precision, creating a timeline that showed not only his non-interference with Karen's structure, but his restraint at every point where others might have retaliated. He didn't hire a lawyer. He didn't need one. The truth had layers now, built one upon another, too thick to be swept away by accusation. The hearing was brief. Karen appeared in person, visibly agitated, her voice raised even before the panel had finished introductions. She spoke rapidly, citing emails, pointing fingers, implying conspiracies. But none of it landed. Her tone betrayed her more than her words. Thomas, in contrast, presented his evidence clearly, patiently, and without comment on her character. The board members listened. They asked questions, and when the hearing concluded, they dismissed Karen's complaint entirely, citing lack of credible basis and noting her prior violations as contributing factors. That night, for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt still. Thomas walked the length of his yard, flashlight in hand, checking the fence, the soil, the water level. Everything was stable. The ground, though misshapen, was no longer shifting. The supports he'd installed had held, and the creek, now unobstructed, whispered softly in the dark. But the final act came not from Karen, not from any further legal attempt or threat. It came from nature. A week later, another storm arrived, the heaviest yet. The rain hit hard, continuous, for nearly 12 hours. Thunder rolled low over the hills, and the creek rose faster than Thomas had ever seen. It didn't just swell. It surged, reclaiming the contours of its old path and pushing with the strength of a force long denied. Where Karen's walkway had once stood, there was now only mud, loosely compacted, poorly backfilled, and brittle beneath the surface. The current found the weakness with frightening speed. At dawn, Thomas emerged to find the far bank collapsed. Not his side. Heron. The entire stretch of ground where the walkway had been anchored was gone, erased in a single night of pressure. What remained was a jagged edge of exposed roots and soil, sloped downward into the current. A large section of Karen's ornamental garden had disappeared, dragged into the creek, the remnants of planters and solar lights floating in the water or lodged in the underbrush downstream. A ceramic statue lay shattered in pieces at the base of a tree, its head resting face down in the mud like some symbolic casualty of vanity. Karen didn't come out that morning. The county marked her property as unstable. Emergency erosion control fencing was installed around the area. An order was issued forbidding further construction of any kind until a soil restoration plan was approved. It was expensive, prolonged. It would take months. And in all that time, Thomas said nothing. He repaired his fence quietly, reinforced the bank with permitted materials, planted a new row of grass along the edge of the creek. He didn't boast, didn't spread rumors. When neighbors passed and commented on the damage to Karen's side, he simply nodded. When asked how he'd kept his own bank intact, he said only, "I listened to the slope." Because in the end, that's what won. Not revenge, not paperwork, not even persistence. What won was the refusal to fight against the natural structure of things. To observe, to adapt, to respond without force. Where Karen had tried to bend the landscape to her will, Thomas had stepped back and let it move, knowing all along that nature had a longer memory than any of them. And when the flood came, It didn't need his help. It finished the work for him. Summer settled over the valley with a kind of reluctant grace, warm but not generous, like it was still uncertain whether the earth had earned peace yet. The grass came in patchy across the bank, and the scars left behind by the creek's last fury remained etched into the landscape, ragged outlines where the earth had sheared off, revealing the root systems beneath. The memory of what had happened was still raw in the soil, even if the neighborhood had begun to move on. People stopped whispering about the flood and the failure, and the caution tape on Karen's side had started to sag under the weight of the sun. There were no more gatherings, no more decorative lights or attempts at symbolism. Her backyard sat vacant, the former seating area now a rough field of uneven dirt and weeds, a borderland between defiance and surrender. Thomas took no satisfaction in the view. He didn't gloat, didn't point out the irony to anyone. He simply got to work. He planted native ground cover that wouldn't erode easily. He reinforced the fencing one post at a time, using techniques approved by the Conservation Office. He scheduled one final visit from Travis, not for assessment, but for confirmation. Together, they walked the length of the creek, and Travis signed off on the stabilization of the bank with a nod and a quiet, "This will hold." Karen remained distant. She passed him occasionally on the street, but only when she had no choice, and when she did, her eyes barely acknowledged him. There was no apology, no attempt to explain. She had retreated into a posture of silence, as if the loss of her project had stolen her voice. But Thomas didn't need anything from her. The moment for conversation had passed long ago, drowned in the moment when concrete first touched the water without permission. One morning in late July, a county maintenance truck arrived unannounced. 2 workers got out, walked along the creek, and removed the final erosion control signs and stakes from both sides. No words, no ceremony, just quiet, efficient conclusion. When they left, Thomas stood at the edge of his yard for a long time, watching the way the sunlight glinted off the water. It wasn't calm. The creek never was. But it was free again, uninterrupted, flowing as it always had, shaped not by will or plans, but by time and terrain. He built a simple bench near the edge of the creek, not where the walkway had once stood, not in any place that suggested conquest or replacement, but just outside the old fence line. He placed it facing the water, angled slightly so it caught the morning sun. No plaque, no carving, just a seat, a place to sit and observe what was always moving. Over the next few weeks he sat there often, watching the birds pick through the brush, the occasional raccoon washing its paws in the shallows, the slow dance of life returning to what had once been threatened by stone and assumption. Neighbors came by sometimes. Elliot brought over a basket of tomatoes from his garden without a word. A woman from the next street over stopped by and asked if the county had ever issued a formal statement. He told her no, that the land had spoken more clearly than any agency ever could, and eventually the questions stopped. People saw the way the water moved now, the way the ground had healed itself. That was enough of a story on its own. Karen's property remained unchanged. Her upper lawn still held its manicured curves and perfect hedges, but below, where the walkway had once reached across the water, there was only bare earth. The silence of that absence spoke louder than anything she could have built. Over time, the space became invisible to her again, a problem unacknowledged, a defeat too large to reframe. And so it remained, unresolved and unspoken. But on Thomas's side, the land grew back slowly, not perfectly, but honestly. And in that steady, uneven return, there was something deeply satisfying. Not triumph, not victory, just alignment. He didn't build anything else, didn't pave or sculpt or redesign. He let the earth resume its shape and let himself return to the rhythm he'd always known. A life not of ownership, but of stewardship. And each day, as the creek whispered through the channel it had carved by its own rules, Thomas knew he had done what needed to be done. Not to win, but to endure. And in the quiet movement of the water, there was no more resistance, only flow.